some point, it will be legislative activity. I'd love to hear those thoughts.
Madam President, in watching the United States Senate before I arrived here and in studying the United States Senate throughout history, the beauty of this body has been the individual rights of every single senator. And with the change we've seen, I believe those rights now are diminished, which translates into the people who live in states that are represented by the minority will not be heard in this body. I've been surprised. I have been shocked. And I have been hurt by comments from the majority where I am referred to as an obstructionist, where my colleagues on this side of the aisle are referred to as extremist, anarchists. I don't really even know how to respond to that, Senator Johans, because nothing could be further from the truth. How I view this body is one that should have an agenda. We should be having members on the floor participating in debates on bills, following an agenda, and taking votes. But we don't see that. Instead, we see the two of us here and our friend and colleague, senator in the chair, speaking to an empty chamber, speaking to TV cameras. That's not the way this place is supposed to operate. We're supposed to be doing the people's work. I don't know, Senator Johans, what we're obstructing, because as a member of the Armed Services Committee, we passed the National Defense Authorization Act out of committee in May. We passed that out of committee in May. We could have taken it up in June. We could have taken it up in July, September, October. And instead, we seem to be in this crisis management mode in one of the greatest bodies in the world. That makes no sense. I'm ready to do the work, but until these bills appear on the agenda, how do we do the work? Why do we wait until we have a few days left in the year to take on what I believe is our most sacred responsibility? The defense of this country, our national security, our military men and women, our veterans. The committee passed out a great bill in a bipartisan vote, and it's passed here in the Senate for the last 50 or 51 years. But yet we are up against a time limit now that was manufactured. As I said, the bill came out in May. Why wasn't it on the agenda? Why can't we have amendments to it? Very important amendments. I happen to have a good amendment with Senator Claire McCaskill, Democrat from Missouri, and Senator Kelly Ayotte, a Republican from New Hampshire, that we believe makes the provisions in our committee bill dealing with sexual assault even better, even stronger, that will protect victims. And we are not allowed to have that amendment. Again, that's just a foreign concept to me. As a senator, not being allowed to have an amendment on a bill that should have been brought up on the floor months ago, so we could have had a debate on this truly #1 priority of our country. And instead, we have crisis management. Now, I don't know about you, Senator Johans, but I don't respond well to crisis management. I like to have time to make wise decisions, to make measured decisions, to gather information, to represent our constituents, to represent the American people. The American people demand more. They demand us to be better. I can't even imagine what folks think when they know we're here speaking to an empty chamber, when we should be talking about the big issues of the day, when we should be talking about the National Defense Authorization Act, when we should be talking about sexual assault in the military, when we should be talking about how are we going to make sure that our military men and women have the resources that they need to keep them safe so that they can return to their families and so that they can return to their families whole. We should be talking about Iran. We should be talking about Benghazi. But we're not. Because we are not allowed to have that legislation before us. So as a new senator here in the United States Senate, I can tell you I am very frustrated, and I know when you're back in the state, you hear as I do, that the people of Nebraska are frustrated as well. And I believe that they reflect the views of the people of this country. They expect more from us. They expect us to be better. They expect us to do our jobs. How can you do your job when you're not allowed to vote on legislation that addresses the truly pressing issues of our day? So I say to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, yes, I'm frustrated. I'm upset. I'm angry that I am not able to represent the people of my state by taking a vote. By taking a vote on amendments that all of you feel are important as well. It's not just Republicans offering amendments that don't get heard. It's Democrats as well. I would imagine you are so very frustrated. This has got to change. This has to change. I don't know how long it's been going on, but we can change this. We can change this by having an agenda that works, an agenda that brings bills up, by a leader who's going to have an open amendment process. So instead of us coming down here and addressing a camera, we are able to debate each other and have our voices heard. Have our voices heard because we're representing those voices back home. And they expect that. We need to do this. Maybe I'm naive, Senator Johans, but I think we can do it. I think we can still come together and be able to work together. You know, sometimes you hear the terms obstructionist, extremist, anarchist. You know, enough of that. It's not just Republicans who are demanding their rights. and who are exercising their rights. I know that we have Democrat colleagues who have put holds on nominations. They're not obstructionists. They're not extremists. They're exercising their rights as members of the United States Senate. They are exercising their rights to have questions from their constituents answered. And I will defend their rights to put holds on nominations until they get those questions answered. We don't always hear about that, though. We don't hear that it's all of us in here who have that duty to make sure that we can have our constituents' concerns answered. So we can have a project back in our state that's being held up for one reason or another addressed. So we can bring forward a question from our governor in our state or our state legislature that an agency has not addressed in a timely manner, where we as United States senators can push a little harder to get an answer from a nominee or an agency. That's checks and balances. That's a balanced government. That's transparency. That's accountability. It's not allowing the executive branch to get everything they want. None of us get everything we want. Senator Johans, you made the comment, as governor, it's give and take. As a state senator, I can tell you I had to compromise on bills that I thought were great the way I had them drafted. But you need to compromise with your colleagues, with the governor, with the president, in order to truly represent all the people in this country. Because, Senator Johans, I'm sorry to say this country is polarized. This country is polarized, and the United States Senate is polarized. And if we can show some leadership in here, if we're going to be able to take on these hard issues, to make tough decisions, to make hard choices, then we're going to be able to be good examples to our country. We're going to have a brighter future. We're going to show some leadership that we are elected to make those hard choices for the American people so that we can go forward. With that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor so that my colleague has time to address issues before us. Thank you.
Mr. President,
Senator from Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank my colleague for being with me for this colloquy. I appreciate it so much. The legislative experience that Senator Fisher brings to this body is very, very extensive. She was regarded as the leader in the Nebraska unicameral and chaired an extremely important committee, and she would be too modest to point this out, but at a time when our road system needed funding, she figured out a way not only to identify funding, not by raising taxes, but by better efficiency and better management, and it was a significant amount of funding, and then build the coalitions necessary to actually get that passed. And back home today, that's getting rave reviews. And I thank you for that because I drive on those roads. I know you do too. Mr. President, my colleague mentioned the defense bill, and nothing could be a better example of what we're dealing with here. This bill came out of the Armed Services Committee, which has a reputation for being one of the most bipartisan committees in the whole Senate system. It's not about Republicans and Democrats on that committee for a whole host of reasons. One is there's just great leadership on that committee, and there's been great leadership in the past. but the focus is on the national defense of our United States and our allies. Now, for 50-some years, we've passed a defense appropriations bill. It's one of the things, even when nothing else could get done, we got that done. And the hallmark of it is it's a very open process. So the bill comes out of committee. This one came out in May. And the amendment process starts, and we might go days working our way through that bill. And it's just very normal. It is very much a part of the process, and at the end of it, typically that bill is passed with very strong bipartisan support. Well, what happened that you would get a bill in May that has bipartisan support in the committee, comes out of the committee, is ready for floor action, that you couldn't get to that bill except right before the holidays? To me, Mr. President, that's like sending a message. We all know who controls the floor. Democrats control the floor. They're in the majority. The majority leader, through the election by Democrats, controls the floor. And it feels to me like what we are saying to our United States military is you're not important enough that we would give you 2 or 3 weeks in June or July, September, October, to work through this huge package of spending. In fact, we're going to relegate you to the last hours before the Christmas break. And then the majority leader is going to say, and you folks in the minority, by the way, I'll pick your amendments. I think some of these amendments are pretty tough amendments for my people to vote on, so I'll pick the amendments. So what happened to the right of every individual senator to come to the floor of the United States Senate and offer their idea on a piece of legislation, or for that matter, any other important issue facing our United States? And it's like sending a message to the military from the Democrat majority that, look, you're important enough to get a few hours before we break and we all go back and we all enjoy a big ham dinner for Christmas and we open our presents while you're off fighting in Afghanistan or wherever you've been ordered to serve. And I don't think that's right. There isn't any reason why this bill can't get done. It's been done for 50-some years. What's tough about that? There isn't any reason why this bill can't get called up in the summer. There isn't any reason why we can't deal with this bill in June. It came out in May. There isn't any reason why we can't use these months leading up to now, the end of the year, to pass this bill. There are few guarantees in the United States Senate these days, but one guarantee I can make is if you allow this defense appropriations bill to go through the regular process, allow senators to offer their amendments, come to the floor, debate their amendments, pass those amendments or not pass those amendments, at the end of the day, that bill will pass. Instead, what happened is the bill is put on the floor right before the holiday break. The majority leader says, I'll decide whose amendments are going to get heard. I'll be the one picking the amendments. And we got to get this done. And if you don't agree with the way I want to do things around here, then you're an obstructionist. You're an anarchist. Well, wait a second. I should have a say about that bill. It spends billions and billions of dollars. I should be able to go home to Nebraskans and say, you know, I gave my best effort with an amendment that I supported or sponsored or whatever, but at the end of the day, I won or I lost. After all, that's what they elected me to do. So, Mr. President, it's not just what happened with the nuclear option. It's the way this United States Senate is being operated by those who are in the majority Democrats. Never in the history of this institution has a leader filled the amendment tree, which is a fancy Washington way of saying, I'm taking away the amendments from the minority, more times, far and away, than any other majority leader. And when you do that, when you take away the right to amend, you silence the minority. Because we don't control what comes to the floor. We're not in the majority. We don't control when a bill is going to be heard. We're not in the majority. So the only thing we can do as a minority is offer an amendment and plead our case. Now, Senator Fisher mentioned a perfect example of the point I am trying to make here. She says that she and others, bipartisan, have an amendment on sexual assaults, which we know is a very serious problem. Now, some might find this surprising, but I want her amendment to go further. I don't think it goes far enough. I don't think she would mind me saying that. I signed on to Senator Gillibrand's amendment. I was one of the early ones to sign on. It's a bipartisan amendment. It's got over 50 co-sponsors. That's the amendment I want. I think this is an important issue. I see these young men and women come to my office. They are proud as proud can be. They've just signed up, or they want to go to the military academy, and it breaks my heart to think that they may be subjected to sexual assault in the military. I believe we can't be tough enough. I believe we can't work hard enough to create an atmosphere that is so inhospitable to the sexual offender that they would never think of being in the military. I want to go as far as we can go. And I want to argue that point. And I believe there'll be Nebraskans that would agree with me or disagree with me. Why shouldn't we have a bond floor?
All post-closure time has expired,
Thank you, Mr. President.
and the question occurs on the nomination.
Ask for the ayes and nays.
Is there sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reid of Rhode Island, Mr. Reid of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Booker, Durbin, Heinrich, and Reid of Nevada. Senators voting in the negative: Johans, McConnell, Scott, and Vitter. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch. No. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray. Aye. Mrs. Fisher. No. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. No. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo. No. Mr. Flake. Mr. Flake. Aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley. Aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts. No. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand. Aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell. Aye. Mr. Kane. Aye.
Mrs. Wolford.
Mr. Manchin. Aye. Mr. Blunt? No. Mr. Isaacson? No. Mrs. Hagan? Mrs. Hagan? Aye. Mr. Toomey? No. Mr. Donnelly? Aye. Mr. Markey? Aye. Mr. Inhofe? Mr. Inhofe? No. Ms. Mikulski? Ms. Mikulski? Aye. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin? Aye. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed of Rhode Island? Aye. Mr. Grassley? Mr. Grassley? No. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono. Aye. Mr. King. Mr. King. Aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Aye. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich. Aye. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz. Aye. Mr. Franken. Mr. Franken. Aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson. Aye. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Grassley. Aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn. No. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders. Aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee. No. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran. No. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz. No. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen. Aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran. Aye. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi. No. Mr. Alexander. No. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy. Aye. Mr. Burr. No. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain. No. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Pryor. Aye. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy. Aye. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coates. No. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons. Aye. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Coburn. Aye. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Cardin. Aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby. No. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow. Aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ai, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, aye.
No, it's not. Keep hurting yourself.
Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, no. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, no. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. I got you. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Ms. Heitkamp. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Yeah. Oh, no, I don't. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye.
Oh, it's a lot different. All right. I think I'll write a book. It'll be entitled
Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye.
To change their vote.
Any senators in the chamber wishing to change their vote? If not, the ayes are 70 and the nays are 29. And the nomination is confirmed. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Lanja B. McCafferty of New Hampshire to be United States District Judge for the District of New Hampshire, signed by 19 senators.
Pursuant to Rule 22, the chair now directs the clerk to call the roll to ascertain the presence of a quorum.
Alexander, Ayotte, Baldwin, Barrasso, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt, Booker, Bozeman, Boxer, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Coons, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Donnelly, Durbin, Enzi, Feinstein, Fisher, Flake, Franken, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Hagan, Harkin, Hatch, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Heller, Hirono, Hoven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Kirk, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Lee, Levin, Manchin, Markey, McCain, McCaskill, McConnell, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Moran, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Paul, Portman, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Risch, Roberts, Rockefeller, Rubio, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Scott, Sessions, Shaheen, Shelby, Stabenow, Tester, Thune, Toomey, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Vitter, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wicker, Wyden.
A quorum is present. The question is, is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Lanja B. McCafferty of New Hampshire to be United States District Judge for the District of New Hampshire shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
This is what the clerk.
Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich,
No.
Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher,
No.
Mr. Flake,
No. Short? Yes, sir. I am. Yes, I understand. I'm flattered. I am.
But I can see a scenario.
I saw the picture. She is
Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp,
Hey, buddy.
Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Ayotte, Baldwin, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Coons, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murphy, Nelson, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mrs. Murray, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Graham, Grassley, Heller, Hoven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Portman, Roberts, Rubio, Shelby, Thune, Vitter, Wicker. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Flake, no. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. Risch, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye.
Bang the gavel. On this vote, the yeas are 58 and the nays are 40 and 1 senator present. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, the judiciary. Lanja B. McCafferty of New Hampshire to be United States District Judge for the District of New Hampshire.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
on behalf